And the best thing is to arrive at a position where you can take your work seriously, but not yourself seriously. I used to work for a company that made Vicks Vapor Rub. And one year there was a flu, and we sold a hell of a lot of Vicks Vapor Rub. The other influence was my father. My father was a mystic. He was a person who meditated, and whenever my mother said you have to make a living, he would also remind me that you have to make a life. I feel that the diaspora has been an inspiration for Indians back home. The success of Indians in Silicon Valley have inspired youngsters in Bangalore, Chennai, Pune, Hyderabad. The latest one is a memoir called Another Sort of Freedom, and this I wrote during the COVID years. Penguin had been asking me for an autobiography, and precisely they said that booksellers and readers want to know why I quit a corporate career at its peak and became a writer. And so I think I was getting on in age, and when COVID came, it presented an opportunity because you couldn't go out, and so you went in and you went back to your memory, and the thing you begin to then remember. And when you start remembering events, then you find patterns in your life. You start connecting the dots in your life. And this then results in a memoir. Memoir is different because memoir is not a chronological event. It takes a theme. So, in fact, I began to understand myself. That was the amazing thing. So, as I say that to write a memoir, you have to relive your life, and reliving your life, I feel, is better than living it. One, you begin to understand yourself. Second, you play God, and you select the portions that are connecting with the dots, and you don't need to put everything into the kitchen sink into the story. And of course I would get everyone, I would say, should write a memoir, because it helps you to understand who you are. But the temptation in writing a memoir is to want to look good. Now, you don't want to look too good, because the reader then will say, oh God, he's a pompous ass, and why should I read him? Or the opposite, when you try to become too humble and make too many mistakes that you talk about, and then the reader says, oh my God, he's a loser, why should I read him? So it's best to be yourself and put the good with the bad and connect the dots to tell your story and become a little wiser. So that was the impetus in writing this book. What I found, of course, is that when I connected the dots, I found the connection in this word, freedom. And what is that other sort of freedom? Well, maybe if I read you the dedication of the book, it'll come alive. I've dedicated the book to the happy few who don't take themselves too seriously. And so this is really the whole idea, that somehow we live according to expectations. First, there are expectations of our parents, our families. Then there are expectations of oneself. The expectations of yourself is, oh, I should be somebody, not a nobody. those kind of things. And the best thing is to arrive at a position where you can take your work seriously, but not yourself seriously. And so diminish the ego a little bit. You can't eradicate the ego, which is the aspiration of religion. And that's, I'm not a very religious person, but in a sense, my search for meaning and purpose in this book is really what is a religious enterprise for others, and in terms of diminishing the ego. I have also just published a slim volume, essay-sized book called The Dilemma of an Indian Liberal. And this really does discuss the question of the future of India. Both, a liberal, I became a liberal in my late 30s. I had been a socialist like everyone else. I had grown up in India, which was a proud, robust, liberal democracy, but it had a very bad economy. It was a socialist command economy. Well, the people Nehru was a compassionate man. He wanted a life, an economy of equality. But what he got from the bureaucracy and from the planners was a command economy, which took away our freedom. So I'll just give you a small incident, which was my conversion from socialism to liberalism. I used to work for a company that made Vicks Vapor Rub. And one year there was a flu, and we sold a hell of a lot of Vicks Vapor Rub. And we thought we'd done a good job in the middle of an epidemic, provided relief to millions of families around the country. But at the end of the year, we got a summons from the government saying that we had broken the law. So I was hauled up and taken to Delhi, and I had to meet the officer who kept me waiting for 2 hours outside his office. And then I was summoned into his office, and he was reading the newspaper, and he kept reading it while I kept sitting in front of him. And finally he put the paper down and he said, "Kya?" I said, "Saab, aap bataiye kya? Aapne hum bulaya hai yahan. You've called us here." And he said, we looked at I gave him the summons. So he says, "You've broken the law. Explain." So I explained to him that there was a flu, and I thought we were doing our duty by keeping the chemist shops and pharmacies stocked with Vicks during this epidemic. And I thought we had done a lot of good by bringing relief to millions of homes. And he says, "But you broke the law." Now the law that he's talking about was the license that we had. We had a license to produce only so many tons of Vicks Vapor Rub a year. And if you exceeded that you broke your license, you violated your license, and there was a jail sentence. It was a criminal offense, and there was a jail sentence attached to breaking the law. And that's what he was talking about. And I said, "Yes, it's true. We did break the law." So then he says, "You chaps in the private sector are all crooks, and I want to make an example of your company, especially you multinationals who you think you're high and mighty and you can get away in a poor country. And I was sort of frightened. And he says, now the law will take its course. So, ab jaiye, jao. So he threw me out of his office. But as I was leaving his office, I don't know what got into me, but I said, sir, this news will get out. It's not every day that a person, an executive of a multinational company, is sent to jail. And so it'll appear in the New York Times, in all over the world, in India. And what do you think people will think of our country? That here was a company, here were some people who genuinely helped a country during its epidemic, and the country rewards such people by sending the person to jail. Don't you think they'll think us odd? What do they think of our laws? What will they think of our Prime Minister? Anyway, I had a bunch of sleepless nights after that, but eventually the government dropped the case quietly and nothing came of it. But that's the time of my conversion. I changed from a socialist to a liberal. Well, you've asked me about my life and how my life has given purpose and what sort of lessons it might hold for young people today. Well, I had two influences in my life which I have described in my memoir. One influence was that of my mother. I came and my mother kept reminding me that one day I had to make a living. So I better study hard and get into a good college and so on, and then get a good job. The other influence was my father. My father was a mystic. He was a person who meditated, and he was a more relaxed individual. And whenever my mother said, you have to make a living, he would also remind me that you have to make a life. Now, I wasn't quite sure what he meant by making a life, but I'll give you an example. I was in kindergarten and I came home one day with my report card, and my mother was waiting at the door, and I was sporting this green report card, and she asked me, did you stand first? My father was standing nearby, and my father says, that was the wrong question. Ask him what he likes about his school. Does he like to draw? Does he like stories? Who are his friends? And so this idea of my father begins to influence me right from that moment. And I had the unbelievable luck of getting a scholarship at the age of 17 to go to Harvard. Now, this didn't happen very often in 1960, but I got that opportunity, and I still remember my mother and father came to Palam Airport in Delhi to see me off, and my mother had tears in her eyes, and she's saying, now remember, you must study something useful when you go there. You have to come back home and make a living. And she says, why don't you be like your father? He's an engineer. Do become an engineer. India needs engineers. So I arrive at Harvard and I declare engineering as my major, and I have a roommate, and the roommate is studying Russian literature, and he's reading Anna Karenina. And one day at lunch he says, you know, if you're going to have an affair with a married woman, it should be Anna Karenina. And I said, what the hell? Here he's dreaming of sleeping with Anna Karenina, and I am mugging up Bernoulli's equations and studying pipe friction, and this is not right. So at the next semester, I drop engineering, and what do I study? I study Greek tragedy, I study the comic spirit in Western literature, I study history of Rome, I study Renaissance painting, I study Bauhaus architecture, I even take a course in Sanskrit love poetry. And when my mother learns that I'm studying Sanskrit and at Harvard, she says, "Hi, hi, mera munda," a dead language. Now only the dead will give him a job. Well, my father though, reassured her that what I was doing at Harvard was making a life through books. And my father was so right. I could never write the kind of books I write today if it had not been for that education, which was a broad liberal education. And so to young people today, I say, and even in India today, we have a very fine university called Ashoka. Ashoka University provides a broad liberal education. And I would say that use that university period. Later, you can always study law, you can study medicine, you can study business, go to do those things. But don't waste your undergraduate years studying anything useful that my mother had given me. And it is this advice of my father that led me on, because after graduating, I finally, by the way, did major in philosophy at Harvard, and then I studied philosophy under John Rawls, and then I got a scholarship to go to Oxford to study philosophy under Isaiah Berlin to do a PhD. But I was back home in Chandigarh that summer, and one day I asked myself, did I really want to spend the rest of my life at that stratosphere of abstract thought? No. I wanted a life of action. And so I wrote off to Oxford quietly without telling my parents that I wrote that I was not coming. And my mother's worst nightmare came true. She had a grown-up son at home, what we call vela, meaning idle. And we had a nosy neighbor who'd come to visit my mother, and she would always ask her, "Thoda munda ki kar raha hai? What is your son doing?" And my mother would get very embarrassed, and she wouldn't know what to say. And when I saw that embarrassment on her face, I answered the first advertisement in the paper that I found in the next few days. It was a company that made Vicks Vapor Rub. And I had studied, those days you didn't need an MBA. They thought I had done a reasonable education, and I guess they were impressed with my Harvard degree, and they offered me the job. And so that was another moment where I followed my father's advice. I gave up a promising academic career to go. I was transported overnight from the ivy-covered halls of Harvard to the dusty bazaars of India, where I was carrying a salesman bag during my training, asking chemist shops how many dozens of wicks can I send you, and so it was a very different life. But slowly, I liked the rough and tumble of the business life, and I did reasonably well there. I went on from there to become the head of the company. By then, Procter & Gamble had bought the company worldwide, Richardson Vicks, and we had become Procter & Gamble, and I had become the head of that company. And it was then I was in my 40s, and the company, after 10 years of running the Indian business, they transferred me to headquarters to prepare me for higher responsibility of the company on a global basis. And it was then that I began asking the question, is this what life is all about? And this was not, this is not, I don't think I was unique. I think many people who work hard, get good jobs, follow the advice of their parents, and they start climbing ladders in their work life, and then they get into their 40s and they ask the same question about the purpose, the meaning of life. And only in my case, it happened 2 years after the 1991 reforms. For me, as I said, 91 reforms was true azadi. And after 2 years, as I was driving to work one day in Cincinnati, Ohio, where the headquarters of our company, I listened to NPR radio, and the announcer is saying that the reforms in India are in trouble. The left wing of the Congress party is turned against Narasimha Rao, and no one is defending the reforms, and people are afraid that the reforms might get reversed. And I got really scared. And that day I was going to a global meeting at the company, and I was listening to managers present their plans for the future. And I asked myself, what am I doing here in Cincinnati, selling Vicks Vapor Rub, Tide detergent, Pampers, Pantene shampoo, and lots of very good products. But is this what life is all about? And no. So I got very depressed. I came home. Let's go back home. Things are in trouble. And she says, but what will you do back home? You have no business, you have no experience in politics. But I had met Manmohan Singh when I was running the company in India. He was not a big man. He was in the finance ministry, and I think it was planning commission. So I shot off a telegram to him, and I said, look, what's going on? Why is nobody defending the reforms? And are the reforms in trouble? And he very sweetly replied, and he said, you come back to India and you help sell the reforms. I think what he was alluding to was that I had already become a weekend writer. I had written 3 plays in my 20s. I had written a novel in my 30s. I had written articles, op-eds in the paper. And so I convinced my wife. She was very worried because she was thinking, when the salary check will not come now at the end of the month. And was she going to be the wife of a starving writer now? But fortunately, we had worked abroad, and so we had savings that we could take back. and it wasn't so bad if we invested them properly. And we had a home already in India. And so I came back. But again, what was driving me was my father's advice. I had followed my mother's advice to make a living, but now I think it was my father's advice which was to make a life. First of all, I've been a member of the diaspora, and I worked on 4 continents for my company. It was a multinational company, and so I identify with the diaspora. In my case, I came back because I feel I could only really live in India. But I also feel that the diaspora has been an inspiration for Indians back home. The success of Indians in Silicon Valley have inspired youngsters in Bangalore, Chennai, Pune, Hyderabad to create the IT revolution that India has created. So we owe a great deal of debt. And today I feel so proud that India has delivered 70 CEOs to global corporations. And I would just say though that the way I think of the world, I think of the world as first that because I have also been like you in the world, I feel I'm a citizen of the world, but I feel strongly rooted in India. And my nationalism is not a nationalism of power. It's a nationalism of memories of my grandmother telling me stories from the Mahabharata when I was young. My memories are those of the Himalayas where I grew up in Shimla in the Himachal Pradesh, where snow-covered mountains of the Himalayas. Those are my memories. And so I feel that there is a good and a bad nationalism. A good nationalism is about these things, the memories of one's country, what you have, the feelings. But that good nationalism doesn't even have to stop at the borders of your country. You should raise your horizon to see beyond your borders and identify with the rest of the world as part of humanity. And that's why I was a big supporter of globalization. And globalization has done so much good. For India, we've been the back office of the world. China, of course, even bigger, was the factory of the world. So 2 of the biggest countries in the world have risen on the back of globalization. But now globalization is under threat from this narrow nationalism. And the narrow nationalism has also this 19th century nationalism, which was based on the idea of either one religion or one language or one ethnicity. No, I think the good nationalism is that a country, the only reason to live in your country is the opportunities that your country provides. That is to say, your citizenship is based on consent. And if your country does not provide good governance, it does not provide opportunities, there's nothing wrong with leaving it to go and work outside. You'll always carry the strength of your roots with you. And you can have many roots. This idea that our only roots can be Hindu roots, that is not right. We are products of many civilizations. that have come and gone. And this is true for all people in the world. There have been many influences. We've had influences from the Persians, we've had influences from the Greeks when Alexander came, and that whole style of architecture, sculpture developed at that time. We should celebrate all these influences, and it should not be only that nationalism of power, that we are superior. That leads to fascism, and liberalism defeated fascism in the Second World War, and that nationalism is been discredited. Of course, the fact of the matter is that we also made a mistake. And I blame those generations of idealistic people who created a constitution, but we never quite had a dialogue with tradition, with our civilization of dharma, and therefore we stepped. I'm talking about the elite. One of the problems of liberalism is that it's an elitist pursuit, and secondly, unfortunately, Gandhi died too soon after independence. Gandhi had, in fact, had a dialogue with tradition. That's why the ideas, liberal ideas of liberty, equality, were taking root during the freedom struggle, because Gandhi had sold those ideas in the language of dharma, in the language of sarva dharma, and so but after Gandhi died, nobody has sold the constitution the way it, and people still today believe the constitution sort of fell from the heavens one day and it's not ours. Well, we have to make people believe it is theirs, and so we still have that unfinished project of selling the constitution. The other factor is that there is today, and the rise of Hindutva is partly because of resentment against the 15% elite which speaks in English. After 75 years, all the serious business of the state and in the private sector is done in English. And if a bright young person walked into a room where we were discussing policy, that person would feel deaf. Imagine feeling deaf in your own country. And that's tragic. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should make Hindi our national language. No, we've learned too well from what the mistakes Pakistan and Sri Lanka made when they tried to impose Urdu, and what they got instead was Bangladesh. In Sinhala, they tried to impose in Sri Lanka, and they got a civil war that lasted for a whole generation. No, the answer is to more organically fit English and Hindi into our lives. And that's why I love English, the language of the bazaar. Where my newspaper boy says, "Saab tension mat lijiye, kal bill zarur milega." And so this is how we mix. And the announcer on Zee TV says the other night, "Aaj Middle East mein peace ho gayi." Mixing the two words, that's how language is developed. So we don't want our government to impose a language. We want it to develop organically. This is how English developed, but in 100 years English produced Shakespeare. Now we need to produce a Shakespeare of English and make that into a literary language. Well, who knows what will happen, which language we'll be speaking 100 years from now. But all I can say to you people in our diaspora is that engage in the affairs of the country that you're living in. and engage in the public affairs, but don't be ashamed of your roots. There's a great richness in those roots. And fortunately, because I studied Sanskrit at Harvard, I've been able to come back and write books like The Difficulty of Being Good, which interrogated the Mahabharata. And I've taken actually the Mahabharata, the Dharma, the notion of Dharma into the 21st century, made it meaningful for people. So that really then is that practice the good nationalism. The good nationalism is an inclusive nationalism, and that shows you, yes, we love our country when we win a cricket match. Of course we should be proud, but let's not find targets to blame. Let's not try to blame history and have that sense of the idea that always was of our secularism. Secularism in India is not just separation of church and state. It is respect for all religions. Sarva Dharma.